Welcome to the opening keynote event of the Climate Smart and Climate Ready Conference. I'm Nicholson. I'm the president of Sustainable Tompkins, and we are serving as your coordinator and host for the conference. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, for being willing to get climate smart and climate ready, and to thank you for being willing to recognize the need for action now. And thank you for being willing to get involved in protecting and preparing our communities for the many challenges that lie ahead as climate change hits home. Last fall, our Assemblywoman, Barbara Lifton, initiated a conversation with representatives from the nonprofit, higher education, local government, and youth and business sectors in Cortland and Tompkins counties about the need to respond to the threat of climate change here at the local level. Of course, much has already been underway locally for many years, but we agreed that coming together for a conference that shares what we've been doing across our upstate region would be useful and hopefully would attract new people into this absolutely vital conversation that we need to have. Now, all of us sitting here tonight owe a debt of gratitude to the conference sponsors. We ended up with a grand total of 31 sponsors, more than I think any event that Sustainable Tompkins has ever managed. And I want to thank my colleague Peter Bardaglio from Tompkins County Climate Protection Initiative and Assemblywoman Lifton for helping me secure the funds necessary for us to put on this 4-day event. And I know that many of you might expect to see the Park Foundation as a major sponsor for an event like this, but I wondered if you would expect to see two locally owned insurance companies as major sponsors for this conference. McNeil and Company out of Cortland and Dryden Mutual Insurance, which is a cooperative of 150-year-old cooperative. Both of them were very quick to respond to our vision for the conference. And I remember when we were visiting with Bob Baxter of Dryden Mutual, I mentioned that insurance companies were the very first business sector to acknowledge climate change and to speak in favor of carbon emissions limits back in Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992. And he responded that their reinsurer, Swiss Re, has been working on climate change for over 30 years now. The insurance industry understands risk when they see it. So they know that the damage from climate change could really undermine their business model. But we also want to acknowledge the significant support from Holt Architects, the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future, Adelaide Park Gomer, and Assemblywoman Lifton. And add to that list, which I won't name them all because there's so many, but other local businesses, local governments, universities and colleges and nonprofits they've all pooled together to make this thing come together. There's a big poster out in the lobby that you can check out to see who has been helping us with this. But I want to say that we also, all of us here tonight, owe a big debt of gratitude to the 20 or more people who've been planning this conference since last fall, and the new 20 or so people who have come on as volunteers to help manage the next 4 days, all the hundreds of details. So if you will, I'd like to have the members of the planning committee and our volunteers for this coming weekend stand up for a minute so we can acknowledge you and thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody. I did want to make a little special shout out to a few people who have been just so core and going so far beyond the call of duty in terms of, I can't even mention all the things that they've done, but Leslie Danks-Burke, Frank Kelly, and Kathy Millian, Kitty Gifford, Maribeth Rubenstein, and Alan Quirk. They've all provided key leadership, and it's their volunteer work that has made all the threads come together. This has been our really merry band of climateers, and it's been a pleasure to work with so many talented and generous-hearted people. We've had kind of a short timeline to produce a 4-day conference like this at multiple venues, but I think because of this heartfelt dedication to this issue and a lot of leadership and skill and talent, I think we've taken a very good first step in connecting campus, community, business, and local government, and the youth who are inheriting this climate fight from us. We hope that we provided many entry points into this local climate conversation by offering sessions tomorrow, Friday, on agriculture, over in Cortland at the Grange, on legal matters at the Tompkins County Library at noon tomorrow, and on public health at Island Fitness Center at 5:30 tomorrow. The Youth Power Summit starts Saturday morning up at Ithaca College and runs all day Saturday and Sunday, and they expect several hundred high school and college students to convene there. We're very proud of the work that they're doing. Now on Saturday, our downtown conference opens with a great panel of Cornell scientists who are going to lay out for us the specific impacts we can expect here in our region and how that will affect our farms, our forests, the built environment, and our human communities. Then after that, there are 3 great concurrent sessions that will run all day. The community track is for people who are concerned about climate change and are wanting to figure out how to plug in, how to engage on this issue, how to be influential with others or co-workers or their family members. The business track is for those concerned with keeping our regional economy resilient and stable in the face of climate change. We'll be looking at where the risks are in the insurance session, and then looking at the opportunities for growing the business sectors in clean energy, food production, and green development. And then lastly, our local government tract is designed specifically for elected and appointed officials and government staff. We're going to be showcasing stories from across the upstate New York region of what our own cities, towns, villages, and counties have been doing in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also laying the groundwork for more resilient development. I really believe that we can learn from each other, and we really hope to see many planning board members and elected officials on Saturday. You should know that we have over 75 speakers and moderators over the course of the 4 days of this conference, and they owe our thanks as well for putting together this menu of entry points into this shared work of making our communities more climate friendly and climate resilient. This Climate Smart and Climate Ready conference is for you. It's a chance to learn and to engage, to start to put the climate change challenge in the context of local and regional impacts, responses, and prevention. It's about adopting the precautionary principle in guiding our decision-making about growth and development. It's about embracing no regrets policies that bring us many desirable benefits along with the reduction of fossil carbon emissions, whether that's a green fleets policy to save money on gas or a local ban on fracking to safeguard air and water. We look for the things that will bring a lot of benefits in one move. It's also about, importantly, it's about recognizing the connections and the relationships in our communities, because the kind of system level change that we have to go through requires us to work together, to connect the dots, and to share responsibility. So with that, on with the show. Let me introduce to you our fearless leader, Assemblywoman Barbara Lifton.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. There, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gay. I'm going to be brief because I know you all want to hear our keynote speaker, Mark Hertsgaard, and with good reason. He was in Cortland this afternoon and gave an inspiring talk there, and I know we all want to hear that. I was asked to give a slight bit of history from my perspective on this. For me, it started about a year ago. The fracking issue led me inevitably into the climate change issue with the issue of methane gas release and the work of Bob Howarth at Cornell and now many other universities and scientists around the world. So I started looking more and more at that issue in a new way, and somehow happened across Mark Hertsgaard's book, Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. And I should say that the book is, I don't think Gay said, but the book is going to be out in the lobby after for people, and Mark will sign books. But I happened across his book. Maybe I read the book review in the Times and went and picked up the book and read it. And I just found it a wonderful and inspiring book. Mark both laid out the challenge in front of us in a very realistic way, enough to make everyone sit up and pay attention, certainly. But most of the book is about talking about all the things that are happening all over the country and all over the world in dealing with mitigation of greenhouse gases while adapting to climate change. One of Mark's main points is that because we've waited too long on this issue, because there have been so much of the denier thing going on in our country for the last 10 or 15 years, and we haven't moved in the way we should, we now not only have to bring down the greenhouse gases quickly, but we need to adapt to the real severe climate issues we are inevitably going to be facing. But Mark laid out that in a very optimistic way. So even though I was feeling kind of discouraged, certainly about what our federal government isn't doing on this issue, and while the state is doing some, I mean, both levels of government are doing some, but I felt neither level of government was doing enough. And so I said, well, feeling inspired by Mark's book, I said, well, let me talk to people locally and see whether we might want to do something. So I pulled together all the stakeholders that Gay mentioned and got them around a table and said, do we want to do something here? I know there's a lot going on here, and might we want to do something together in a collaborative fashion to work on this issue? And after a couple of meetings and a little trepidation, everyone started nodding their head and said, yes, we want to do something. We started brainstorming, and of course, we had a long list of things we could do. It got longer and longer. But we decided, look, this is a first thing, and we can't take on too much, and we're just 10 or 15 people around a room. It's all sort of seemed like a volunteer effort. We're going to keep it small, but this is the 125th Assembly District. This is my hometown, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, got to this organic thing, and it just kept growing. And so we have this wonderful multi-layered multi-issue conference about to happen. And I'm always very proud to represent this wonderful place. So just to stop there with the inception of this, I want to just read a quick bio on Mark Hertsgaard so you understand who it is that's speaking to you tonight. Mark is an independent journalist and author. He's covered politics, culture, and the environment for 20 years for leading media outlets around the world, including The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Time, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, The Daily Beast / Newsweek, sister publication Newsweek, NPR, the BBC, and various German and Spanish and French, Le Monde Diplomatique, and so on. He's the author of 6 books that have been translated into 16 languages, including Earth Odyssey, Around the World in Search of Our Environmental Future. And that's where I first met Mark. He was here about 10 or 12 years ago. Some of you may have seen him up at Cornell. Maybe he was at IC too, he thinks. And so I met Mark then, and when I had seen his book, I emailed him and said, Mark, would you come and speak to us? And he said, yes, he'd love to do that. And his most recent book, Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. He's the environmental correspondent for The Nation magazine, a columnist for L'Espresso, and a fellow at the New American Foundation in Washington, D.C. For 20 years, Mark has written about global warming, but the full truth did not hit home until he became a father, and soon thereafter learned that climate change had already arrived, a century earlier than forecast, with impacts bound to worsen for decades to come. Hertsgaard's daughter, Kiara, now 8 years old, is part of what he has dubbed Generation Hot, the 2 billion young people worldwide who will spend the rest of their lives coping with mounting climate disruption. Hot, Hertsgaard's latest book, is both a father's cry against climate change and a deeply reported blueprint for how all of us as parents, communities, companies, and countries can navigate this unavoidable new era. Writing in the New York Times Book Review, Wen Stevenson called Hot a significant contribution that raises the emotional stakes while keeping a clear head. Hertsgaard presents a strong case that there is still time to make an enormous difference. And before I introduce Mark, let me just ask for a round of applause, too, for someone without whom this conference wouldn't be happening, and that's Gay Nicholson. The tremendous amount of work that Gay did. Thank you, Gay. Thank you, and to all the steering committee members and my wonderful staff. And now I give you Mark Hertsgaard.
That's quite a build-up, Barbara. Not sure I can live up to that. All right, can everybody hear me now? Sound person, is that okay with you? If it's not, you can just cut me off here. Gay, I want to thank you too. It really, we met, whatever it was, 10, 12 years ago when I was here, and I was happy when this was coming back up to see your name on all this, and it really is a remarkable thing. I'm very happy to be here to help kick it off because, and I say that sort of selfishly, because as a journalist, so often my job requires me to go off and talk about and talk with and expose bad things and bad people and bad institutions that are doing bad things. And it is a real tonic for me to be able to come to a place where good people are doing good things. And you, with the kind of leadership, and Barbara too, who of course sought me out, and who I've known for some years, it's just wonderful for a jaded, sometimes cynical journalist to be reminded that there really are still good people out there trying to do good things. Now, having said a nice thing to you, I'm going to say a not nice thing to you, because you kind of stole my opening lead. Your opening comments tonight were exactly what I wanted to start with, but genuinely from the heart, that it is, it's really a pleasure to be here in a room with people who care, who are trying to fight this problem, which I think, and the scientists and all the great investigators and students of this problem say is probably the overriding problem facing humanity in the 21st century. Certainly the greatest moral challenge of our time. So it's very nice, especially when you've spent so many years trying to write a book that talks about frankly, the often dark aspects of this problem. It is a real tonic for me to come to a place where people are trying to turn that around, because that really is our only hope at this point. In many respects, it's our only hope in the sense that it's the only way that we have a chance to deal with this. I find, though, that it's also the only hope to psychologically deal with the knowledge that one has when you look directly into, square in the face, the climate problem. It can be a daunting thing. I don't need to tell you, or you wouldn't have showed up here tonight. You obviously know that. And it is, I confess, a temptation to succumb to the despair that inevitably is tickling the back of your brain when you really look at this stuff. And for me, the only real countervailing factor against that despair is to surround yourself with people like yourselves who are coming together and trying to do something about it. I don't know if we're going to succeed. Nobody knows that. But I do know that taking our best shot at it is not only a prerequisite for succeeding, it's for me the only way I can keep getting up and out of bed in the morning. So sincerely and seriously, thank you, and thank you, Barbara. I can't see you any longer now. I don't know where you went up here. Truly, thank you for bringing me here to be with you all. And I'm going to try in the next few minutes and over the next few days to contribute what I can to the efforts that you're making. But above all, I just want to thank you for making them. Inevitably, when I appear at things like this or talk to folks or be on the radio, the question you always get afterwards is, from people who care at least, is, well, what can I do about this? And to me, I always say, well, bless you, you've already done the first and most important thing, which is to ask that question and to make that decision that you want to do something about it. And we can talk, and we will talk over the next 4 days about what that means. And there's no one answer to that, what we do about it. But I'll tell you, by far the most important thing is to decide to do something. If we had half the people in this country who care about this problem, decide and then act upon a decision to do something about it, we would have solved this problem by now. And so one of the most important things that we can all do is not just to come together in gatherings like this, as important as that is, but then to reach out beyond that to the people that you know and love and work with, and just try to recruit 1 or 2 other people. Again, if everybody did that, we would double in size, we would double in influence. And that's what we need doing. So it's wonderful to be here and be a part of it. And since we're a border state here to Vermont, I will quote one of my new favorite lines, which I'm stealing from Maxine Kuhlman, who said, I don't believe it was about climate change, although it might have been. So I don't have the context for this, but the line is just imperishable, I think. She got up in front of a crowd like this and she said, you know, I've learned in my career as a politician that the pessimists are right. The pessimists are right. But it's the optimists who change the world. So thank you all, optimists, for being here. You wouldn't be here if you weren't an optimist. And so let's go change the world. That's our goal here, and that's what really is required, is big changes. And I say that, Barbara mentioned that the book Hot largely came out of me being a father. I had written about climate change for 15 years, actually, before writing Hot. But it certainly changes your perspective, being a parent. And so I come to you and stand to you tonight also as a parent, not just as a journalist. And so for me, you know, climate change, which began as a sort of a professional and political issue, has become a very personal issue for me. And nothing in this world matters more to me than my daughter. And I have to accept the fact that if we don't do something about this problem, she is going to have a very, very challenging future. She's 8 years old. She just turned 8 last week. And if we don't really change the world, I find the kind of future that she's looking at literally unthinkable. But if we fix this problem, and make no mistake about it, we can fix this problem. We can do this. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some very concrete examples of how people are fixing the problem. But if we fix it, and we fix it in a smart way, which, by the way, I love the title for this conference, Climate Smart, Climate Ready, very good. If we're smart about it, we will not just ensure that Generation Hot, my daughter and all of her peers, have a livable planet to live on as they approach adulthood. But we will also fix so many of the other problems that blight our society right now. Arguably, the biggest problem facing us is that there's too many Americans, the richest country in history. There are too many Americans who are out of work, who are out of luck, who are struggling economically in a country where there is no excuse for it. And if we were to get serious about fixing climate change and put those people to work, renovating houses and increasing energy efficiency and putting up solar panels and putting in mass transit and bike lanes and all the other things that I could bore you for hours relating. If we did all that, We would solve the unemployment problem. We would put Americans back to work. We would give people the dignity of work. And let's never forget that work is not just about a paycheck. It is about having dignity and purpose in your life. And the terrible blight that now exists in American society from leaving so many people on the wayside, especially the young people, those of you who are, I can't see quite well enough to know how many students there might be in the room tonight. I'm sure that there are some of you who are teachers of students, and you know that this is not a happy time to be graduating and going out onto a job market. We could change all of that if we got serious about solving this problem. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. Because I get the vibe in the room that most of you already know a lot about climate change, I'm not going to go through the science very much. I think everybody understands at this point that not just that climate change is real, but that, as Barbara mentioned in her introduction, it is now happening, and it is a reality that we have got to face going forward for the coming years. That was, however, it's an indication of just how quickly the debate or the public discussion on climate is finally changing in the United States. That when I published HOT, which was 2 years ago, this spring, it was still a new idea to get across the fact that there had been a paradigm shift in our definition of the climate problem. And for years, the climate problem was seen as this distant, very grave, but very distant problem that would strike in the year 2100 if we didn't get our act together. And that getting our act together basically meant getting off of carbon fuels and stopping with the coal and the oil and the natural gas and shifting to green energy sources and so forth. And the paradigm shift that occurred really in the 15 years that I started covering the story, I wrote my first articles about climate change and global warming were 1989 for Rolling Stone and The New Yorker. And at that point, that was the definition that I just described was prevailing. And now that is still prevailing in much of the press, but the sort of leading edges have come to understand that especially in the last 10 years, that climate change is here. It has arrived, as Barbara was reading out of the promo copy, that it arrived 100 years sooner than scientists expected. And drop the second shoe, which to me is the single most fiendish fact about climate change, is the lag effect, the inertia of it. That once global warming has triggered climate change, that you're stuck with climate change for quite a while. And by the way, global warming and climate change are not the same thing. Global warming is the rise of temperature that kicks off climate change, that triggers climate change. And climate change are the various extreme weather events that we've seen so much of recently, including last summer, the hottest July in U.S. recorded history, worst drought in 50 years, of course, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and so forth. And the lag effect that I mentioned, the inertia, is that once global warming has kicked off climate change, because of the laws of physics, basically, and chemistry, we're stuck with this going forward. The fact, to oversimplify, that the CO2 stays up in the atmosphere for a long time before it dissipates, means that if you put it in a non-scientific terms, which I need as a journalist, that even if we stopped all of the carbon dioxide emissions on this planet tonight, hypothetically, obviously, because it means shutting off all the cars, all the hospitals in this country, all the coal burning in China, all the deforestation in Indonesia, every place in the world, if we stopped everything, the inertia of the climate system would mean that the temperatures would still keep going up for 30 years. That's if we stopped everything tonight. 30 years. So when I was first writing HOT, and my daughter was literally still small enough to carry around in my arms, I was thinking, okay, well, what if we were really effective here and everybody decided this was important? Probably with a superhuman effort, we could get the world off of carbon fuels in 20 years. 20 years plus 30 years is 50 years, which means that the temperatures on this planet will, at best, unless there's some wonderful, miraculous scientific breakthrough. And by the way, there are scientists at Cornell who are working on such a breakthrough. We'll talk about it later. But it's going to be 50 years of rising temperatures that we're looking at. You know, my daughter will be almost my age by the time that we could stabilize the temperatures. And as those temperatures go up, the impacts inevitably will increase. The droughts, the heat waves, the wildfires, the sea level rise. In California, where I live now, although I'm originally from back east, one of the big problems that we're going to have is that we're going to lose about 40% of our fresh water supply, because most of our fresh water supply comes from the Sierra Nevada mountain snowpack, and it very conveniently melts for us in the spring and sends all that water down the hillside to the Central Valley and to the great cities on the coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. And we're going to lose about 40% of that. So we have to figure out a way to deal with that. And that is not just a California problem, because little known fact that most of the fruits and vegetables that are consumed in the United States come out of California, come out of that Central Valley, come out of the irrigation water that comes off those mountains. So you see how we're all tied into one another. So these are problems. This is the paradigm shift that has occurred in these last few years. And so what the experts that I interviewed for HOT, and I interviewed experts all over the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, and of course extensively here in the United States, they have, I think, a very useful mantra for changing how we think about this. So that before the paradigm shift, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of doing something about climate change meant getting off of oil, stopping coal, and shifting to green energy sources in the name of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we're releasing up into the atmosphere. That was the definition of climate policy, climate action. And now, because of the paradigm shift, there's a second, equally important, I would argue, aspect of this. And it's captured by what the scientists and the thought leaders on this say is the following. Our goal must be to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. We have to avoid an unmanageable amount of climate change, meaning that we have got to reduce, again, that traditional meaning of climate policy, we've got to reduce the amount of carbon up there in the atmosphere that is overheating this planet. We've got to avoid unmanageable amounts of global warming. But at the same time, we must manage the unavoidable. The fact that there's going to be rising temperatures for 30 to 50 years on this planet, even if we do a good job of the first half of that challenge. We've got to manage that. We must avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. And so that is the new approach that we've got to be following. And here in Ithaca and Tompkins and Cortland and upstate New York here, it's generally, you're going to want to do both. But that second aspect, the adaptation aspect, that is an inherently local activity. Whereas the first part of the climate challenge, reducing the carbon dioxide and methane and the other gases, of course you do that locally, but that is a global enterprise because it doesn't matter. The Earth's atmosphere does not care where those greenhouse gases originate. If they originate in New York State, or they originate in Ecuador, or they originate in Guangzhou, China, doesn't matter to the atmosphere. And the moral hazard of that reality for climate policy is that it's very easy for any local place to say, oh, what does it matter if we reduce because those other people aren't doing it? I mean, you'll hear that. I hear that usually it's China. Those other people mean those non-white Asians who dare to be trying to climb out of poverty. Why should we? This was the fossil fuel and congressional opposition for years to the U.S. doing something serious about this. Why should we reduce our emissions when the rest of the world won't do it, which was a lie as well, but they were only waiting for Washington to agree. But the point being that when you look at the adaptation side of it, that is intensely local. And I'll share some lessons with you tonight about both of those things, because I think it's at this point really important to spread the good news and the solutions on both sides of this problem. So let me start with one on the front side of the problem. And it's a victory, and I want to talk about it because, again, I think it's very easy for us to fall victim to despair and to thinking this is too big a problem, and those darn fossil fuel companies are too big for us to beat, and they've got Washington locked up, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, the problem with thinking that way is that you never take action. And if you instead realize that, no, they can be beaten, I think you're more inclined to take action. So let me quickly tell you about one of the stories when I'm feeling susceptible to despair that I remember and that fires me up, and I hope it'll fire you up too, which is the story of how we beat coal in this country. I don't know if any of you saw it. I did a piece exactly 1 year ago in Mother Jones magazine about this, which I told the crowd earlier this morning. I wanted to call this piece, the biggest climate victory you never heard of. And unfortunately, the editors at Mother Jones, editors being editors, made a boneheaded maneuver and did not listen to me and then called it some other forgettable title. But this is the story of the biggest climate victory that we have had to date in the United States. And it essentially involves shutting down coal. Coal, new coal, is over now in the United States. And it has been stopped over the last 6 to 8 years by a national grassroots network of people just like you, starting in meetings just like this. And they blocked, at the grassroots level, across the supposedly red states of the Midwest and the South, they have blocked now, I think, 174 coal plants that were ready to go, that the Bush-Cheney administration had on the drawing boards, that the local electric utility companies were ready to build. And these people doing real old-fashioned retail politics, grassroots politics, have stopped them. And it's a story worth paying attention to because of how they did it, because I think it holds lessons for the rest of this climate fight. It was not just the usual suspects, above all. It was, of course, the environmentalists. The Sierra Club deserves a tip of the hat. They played the national coordinating role on this. But it was mainly driven at the local level by a wonderful coalition. It varied in different places, but here's the usual elements. Oftentimes students and young people. Of course, the environmentalists, a lot of local business people, local elected officials, very important role played by the nurses and the physicians and the American Lung Association. They are an ally that is often overlooked by people in this realm. They were critical. The faith community, farmers, and who am I leaving out? Those are the main groups. And it was, as I say, really retail politics. It's different stories. If you want, you should go look at the Mother Jones story. It was in the April 2012 issue, or you can see it on my website at markhertsgaard.com, where it has the right title, by the way. No, I don't. I'm not still carrying a chip on my shoulder about that. But different stories, but usually coming around the same theme, which was that people went out and they knocked on doors and they talked to neighbors and they went to boring regulatory hearings and they read really drone boring reports that then enabled them to go to those meetings and talk persuasively. Then they wrote letters to the editor at the local newspapers. They would bird dog their local representatives at the state level. Now notice, all of this is happening, and this is a large part of the reason you've never heard this story. This was happening outside of Washington, D.C. So it slipped under the radar screen of the national media. But one of the great things about working at the local level and at the state level is that citizens are still close to their government there, or they can be close if they make the effort. You literally can walk up to the person, and even the governor, and talk to that person. And you can also walk up to your state senator or state legislator and talk to them. And if the answers aren't satisfactory, you can, in a very polite way, make it clear that, okay, well, we're going to do our best. I'm sorry we disagree on this, and we're going to do our best to elect somebody different next time. And believe me, that gets their attention. And in fact, that's, with all due respect, I think there might be a sitting member of the New York Assembly here tonight. But with all due respect, she's an exception, of course, but most of them, that's what a politician cares about. And it's not a moral failing. It's the nature of the job. So our job as citizens is to reach them at that level and to say, look, this is what we're going to do. And that's what they did in all of these states. In Iowa, fascinating story in Iowa with Governor Culver, who's a Republican, but who saw the sense of this. Another great story in Texas, where the mayor of Dallas was one of the key leaders of the fight to stop what would have been the single biggest coal project in the United States. It was either 9 or 11 individual coal plants, would have been the single biggest complex. And she joined, along with the medical community there, against that. Why? And with the local business. Why? Because she could see that this would be bad for the local business climate. That if you want to recruit people in the 21st century, if you want to recruit businesses to come to your locality, you better not have ghastly air pollution, because it's going to be very hard for those companies to recruit high-end, the kind of workers that you want. And she could see that, and she got out against it. And so these kinds of coalitions, and they were also very careful in fighting coal, that they weren't just against coal. They were against that coal plant, and by the way, we want it to be green instead. So in Iowa, as I say, it was usually wind power. In other places, it was let's invest, and also Texas, which by the way is the nation's leading producer of wind power. Who'd have thunk it? In other places, it was let's put that money into energy efficiency and put our people to work doing that. And as a result of that, those kinds of deals, the environmentalists were able to make a sometimes creaky but generally workable alliance with labor unions. And anyone who's been working in this field for a while knows that has been an often contentious relationship between the enviros and the labor unions. Another reason to study this coal victory is that they didn't entirely bury the hatchet. There's still some differences, but they have figured out a way to transcend them. And a lot of that is environmentalists finally learning that they have got to have a pro-economic message that speaks to people who are not comfortable, who do have to worry about the weekly paycheck. And so it's an incredibly positive story that we beat coal, which is, still by far the worst conventional fossil fuel there is. And again, you're not going to hear about it from the mainstream media, but it's a really powerful piece of information. And James Madison, one of our early brilliant presidents, had a line that I've always loved that goes like this. In fact, I used it as the start of my very first book. Knowledge is power. And a democratic people must arm themselves with the knowledge that power gives. So we need to know about these kinds of victories so that we can go get and score more of them. So that's the first victory I want to talk about. That's on the front end of the problem. Then another quick example on the back end, and then we'll have some questions. On the back end, maybe two related examples there. The first is the chapter, I think it's chapter 3 in HOT, and it's the story of Seattle, King County, Washington, which in some respects has some parallels to this place in the sense of it's got a kind of a liberal sensibility, and people get it on the environment. People tend to be a little bit more civically active, perhaps. Anyway, there's a great hero, certainly in the United States, the most far-sighted government official on the climate issue. And I mean that at the national level, at the federal level, at the state and the local levels. There's a man named Ron Sims, S-I-M-S, Ron Sims. And Ron was the county executive in Seattle, King County, which is, I think, the 10th biggest municipality in the country. And it's a major player. It is one of the major ports to the Pacific Ocean and Asia. It has the headquarters of a couple of small companies you may have heard of: Microsoft, Starbucks, Amazon, Boeing, and it is also now, without doubt, the farthest ahead on both aspects of climate change. And any of you, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, will benefit from reading the adaptation, the Climate Preparedness Handbook that Ron Sims and his King County staff put together. If you just Google that, or it's in my book, but if you Google the King County, Washington Climate Preparedness Handbook, or you go to ICLEI, the local government's consortium group, you'll find it there. And Ron Sims was the leader on this. And so that's, by the way, another key element of all this. It's very important to have this kind of public push from people, but it is decisive when you can have a public official who shows real leadership. And that's why it's important that you support people like Barbara Lifton, and you support the people who are leading on this, because they are your ticket to success. And if you don't find and sort of nurture and support those kinds of leaders, there's a real limit as to how far you can go. Ron Sims was a fascinating guy, by the way. He was elected to 3 terms in the county executive office, which in most of the country, it would be the equivalent of being a governor, because it's such a large and economically vibrant place. 3 terms. He's African American. There's a 6% of the population in his county is African American, and yet wildly popular, very socially liberal guy, but economically he's for economic justice, but he's also a very pragmatic guy. And he saw early on that climate change was going to be a problem. And he got laughed at. The local paper just hooted at him, derided him when he was first talking about this in 1990. And then he ended up becoming the county executive. And his motto, I said before, avoid the unmanageable, manage the unavoidable. His motto is, I think, equally valuable and a little bit more action-oriented. And it's this: ask the climate question. Ask the climate question. And this works whether you're running a county bureaucracy as he was. He had 13,000 employees, and he told them all, whether they were working in housing or transportation or education or, of course, environment, energy, and all the obvious ones, I want you to ask the climate question. What did he mean by that? He meant, go to our scientists and ask, what will be the conditions, the climatic conditions that pertain in the year 2050? What will be the rainfall? What will be the temperatures? And all the other things that come with that, the growing season and so forth. Of course, it won't be perfect, but as well as you can project it. Tell us what we're looking at. And then you, in the county government, or you in the private business or the insurance sector or the educational sector, or you at the household level, work backwards from what you're going to be looking at in 2050 and put into place today, begin putting into place today, the kinds of measures that will be required to deal with that condition. So, for example, one of the things that they did in King County was that they realized that just like in California, they're going to have a huge problem. Most of their, I don't know about most, but a lot of their water comes from the melting snowpack of the Cascade Mountains, which is essentially the same mountain range that continues down into California. We just call them a different name. And so what that means is that there's going to be both a shortage of water at some times of the year and a surplus of water, aka flooding, at other times of the year. And so Sims told his staff, okay, ask the climate question. They came back to him and they said, okay, well, it's pretty clear that the flooding is going to increase in the years to come. In King County, how many people here have spent any time in Seattle or King County? Quite some. All right. So you know, and this is also another similarity to here. There's a lot of rivers there, and most of those rivers are flowing from the Cascades to the sea. They're carrying Cascade snowmelt to the sea. And so they told Sims that these things are going to be flooding more, and that we definitely need to raise the levees, but sorry, it's going to require raising the taxes, because we need about $30 million every year going forward just to take care of the most critical needs. And Sims says, that's okay, we've got to do it. Well, how many politicians do you know who, first of all, listen to the science? Second of all, then say, okay, we got to do it, we got to raise taxes. But listen to how he did it. Listen to how he did it, because again, it's a lesson that we can all use. He basically said, we're going to treat people like grown-ups. And what we're going to do, we're going to go to all the little towns and the little townships along those rivers. The Green River is the scene in Hot. I talk about one such place, the Green River, which is just south of the city down near the airport, where if that levee breaks, it would cause an estimated $42 million worth of damage to the local economy every day. Why? Because down there, which is, I was down there while reporting this, it looks very nondescript. Well, but there's all these warehouses that supply all of the grocery stores and restaurants in Seattle with their food. Supply, again, that little company known as Starbucks, all of its coffee comes from down there. All of the medical equipment and supplies come from those warehouses that serves Seattle. $42 million of commerce a day. So Ron Sims says, let's go to these townships. We'll talk to the mayors. We'll get the mayors to pull together, again, small meetings like this with the people and say, okay, here's the situation. Here's what the science says. Here's what we're looking at in terms of the flooding. And here's what will happen if we let that occur. And here's how much it will cost to fix it. And they ended up, they penciled it out. It was $40 a year extra in property taxes. And every one of those townships, to their great credit, went ahead with that. And Ron Sims won re-election after that, after raising taxes. Why? Again, because he treated people like grown-ups. He said when his staff came to him, are you sure you want to do this? He says, no, we have to do it, but we have to tell people why. We have to tell people why we're doing it, and then we have to deliver on it. It has to be done to budget. It has to be done capably. It has to do the job, and people have to see the benefits. And they were smart about the co-benefits, so that you don't just increase the levees and strengthen them, you put a bike and hiking path on top of that levee. So now you can go all the way from downtown Seattle all the way out along these levees, way south of the city. So this is something that can be done and is being done. But it depends, and this is, again, another place where I think, again, I'm a visitor here. I'm not, don't pretend to be an expert, but I do see some similarities between Seattle, King County, this part of the world, and the part of the world where I live now in the San Francisco Bay Area, where one of the most important things as you pursue the climate challenge, and in particular climate adaptation, is what I call social capital. or social infrastructure. It was always thought, again, in the sort of the first era of the climate debate, that, look, you know, if, in fact, the Bush-Cheney people used to say this, that, look, if those crazy liberals are right and we're wrong, and the scientists and the science turns out that climate change is a problem, all right, then we'll deal with it. We can adapt to it. And we, as the United States, will be very capable of adapting to it because we're rich and we have the technology to do it. And so that was the view, that if you were rich, that was the main thing that would allow you to adapt, whereas those poor Bangladeshis or those poor Zimbabweans are out of luck. Well, that is not entirely untrue by any means. The world leaders in adaptation, without question, are the Dutch. And they have a lot of other advantages, including 800 years of history of adapting to water. But they also happen to have the great advantage of being rich. And you compare them to Bangladesh, as I do in the book, and Bangladesh is no slouch on the science of this. And they have quite a well thought out and comprehensive national adaptation plan. They just don't have the money for all of it. So, yes, money matters. But at least as much as money, what matters is the social capital. What matters is the social infrastructure. And what I mean by that, it's exactly what's illustrated by that Ron Sims story. You need to be in a place that believes in science, where the populace believes in science, and where the leaders believe in science. You need to be in a place that has a capable, functioning government that is supported by people who are willing to pay taxes, who recognize, like a grown-up does, that things don't come for free in life. And if you want things of value, you have to pay for them. You have to invest in them. And a government that then delivers on that. Contrast that to another place I spent a lot of time reporting for this book, and in fact was just there 2 weeks ago on a big story that will break in the morning about the BP oil spill. Contrast that to Louisiana and New Orleans in particular. We all remember those horrific images of Hurricane Katrina. And I was down there a lot reporting after that. And I was shocked, though I shouldn't have been, shocked to discover that before Hurricane Katrina, the state of Louisiana did not have a building code. You were not required to build to any particular level, even though the historical record and the popular knowledge is very clear that hurricanes hit us all the time. But there is no statewide building code. Why? Because that would be socialism. Literally, that is the argument that you will hear down there, that is socialism. If you're telling me what I can do with my private property, that's not America. And of course, that same attitude spills over into taxes. In so much of the country, this idea that taxes are inherently evil, that they are theft, is something that is going to make those places very, very difficult to adapt to climate change, because you have to pay taxes. You know, I'm the last person who would say that we should just pay, whatever, and the governments don't have to do their part. And corruption and inefficiency has to be zero tolerance. But you are a child if you think that governments can somehow run without money. And so places that accept that the role of science, the role of government, the role of community, the belief that it's not just the individuals that matter, that we're all in this together, and that when difficulties strike, we look out for one another. That will be very important in the years to come. I saw today on the Commons that there's a little store saying, I think it was buy eco, shop local. And that's a small little spark of that idea, the idea of keeping your money here in the community and supporting your community. Because one of the things that the Dutch say about adaptation is, and I mentioned this earlier, adaptation is local, local, local. Nobody is going to come and save you from the outside. They are going to have plenty of problems to deal with themselves. You have got to be able to rely on yourselves. which is why, by the way, the Dutch, a quick funny little story here, why the Dutch are doing what they're doing. Because, now that there's a European Union in Europe, the Dutch have decided that basically if they left it up to the rest of Europe, that in terms of how to deal with climate change, that the Netherlands might just be written off. In fact, that's the quote. They say, we realized that they could look at us and say, well, that northwest part of the continent, it's all lowland. It's just too hard, too expensive to defend, so we're not going to defend that. We're going to put our resources where they matter. And then he looks at me with this classic Dutch understatement, and he says, with a small little grin on his face, he says, but we are Dutch. This is our land. We have lived here 800 years, and we want to stay. And in fact, that's their motto. The national motto for the Dutch is, we are here to stay. And they have, and I say this in the book, it sounds crazy. I think a lot in the book about, well, where should my daughter live in the future when I'm no longer around to maybe take care of her? And it seems crazy that I would put near the top of the list the Netherlands. Because anybody who's been there, you fly into Amsterdam airport, that airport, those runways are 15 feet below sea level. But I'll tell you why I would have her consider that. Because they are working the problem. They are working the problem. They know the problem. They aren't kidding themselves about it. They're willing to pay to fix the problem. And they're working together. All their 800 years of dealing with water issues has created a consensus form of decision making in the Netherlands. And you see this in their politics as well. And so that kind of community attitude, and you see it in places like this, I sense, we certainly have it in the Bay Area, is going to be so vital. That social infrastructure, that social capital. And I dare say that that's something that you all can turn to. Again, the elements, you've got some great scientists here, including, I'll talk quickly about Cornell and then wrap up here. In the Bay Area, we have some of literally the world's leading climate scientists. And up in Seattle, King County, Ron Sims, very early on in 1995, the University of Washington created the Climate Impacts Group. They're now one of the world's leading centers on this. So one of the things that I would strongly urge you to look into, if you haven't already, is to make sure that your planning here is very integrated with the local science, and that there is some kind of focal point for the climate science here in your among your intellectual capital. And we have a Cornell professor who will be up here a little bit later who can maybe talk about that. I will mention quickly one other Cornell professor that I've been working with. It's another example of again, things that can work. Because I mentioned the paradigm shift, and I won't dwell on this, but there's actually been, I would argue, a second paradigm shift, and this is much more recent now in the climate debate, that if it's not urging you to bite off too much more than you can chew, I do think you need to start thinking about this paradigm shift as well. So it's not just that we have to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. It's not just that we have to reduce those emissions and get prepared to live with the impacts. I would argue that we are also now at a point where we have got to talk about ways to not just reduce the emissions, but to actually extract carbon out of the atmosphere. The carbon that's up there. 99% of the climate coverage in the media is about those emissions. Are they going to go up or are they going to go down? You all remember the cap and trade debate a few years ago in Washington, which, by the way, I forgot to mention this when I was talking about the beating coal. Coal was being defeated at the very time the cap and trade was going nowhere on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And why is that? Because in Washington, D.C., you are playing on the terrain of the enemy. They control that. Big oil, big coal, they don't get everything they want in Washington, but they have a pretty effective veto power over anything they don't want. And they get plenty of what they do want as well, but they can stop almost anything. And that was what was happening there. And meanwhile, and so you got all these national media stories about how, the country doesn't want to fight climate change and there's no chance for doing this. And meanwhile, in the real world, in the real country, climate change was being beaten with coal. But anyway, so the point being that those kinds of emissions, and that's where all the discussion is, that's really not the heart of the problem. Because those emissions, we're only arguing about how much more we're going to put up there each year. The problem is the 400 parts per million that are already up there today and are going to stay up there, as I mentioned, because of the lag effect. They're going to be up there. That is what is causing the extreme weather we are experiencing now. Not just the record summer of last year in the United States, but all over the world. The 14 million people made homeless in Pakistan in 2011 because of the floods. Again, we don't hear about that because those are bad people in Pakistan, supposedly. 14 million. China, Russia, these disasters are unfolding everywhere. That's with 400 parts per million up there today. And emissions is only, let's say we all stopped driving gasoline-fueled vehicles and we went to electric vehicles that were powered with solar, so zero-carbon cars. That will affect how much more we rise above 400 million, but it will not reduce the 400 million. We've got to do something about the 400 million. And that means extracting carbon from the atmosphere. And here you're getting into something that is a very controversial topic. It's been called geoengineering. And a lot of the schemes for doing geoengineering are, I think the technical term is wacko. Because, it's things like, let's put a giant mirror up in the sky and divert some of the sun's rays before they can get here. Or let's pour a bunch of iron filings in the ocean because that will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, it will kill everything under the water too. But so there's a lot of craziness. And in fact, there's a book that I'm just reviewing right now called Earth Masters that talks about this. Jeff Goodell, the excellent environment and energy correspondent for Rolling Stone, also wrote a book on this a couple years ago called Cool the Planet. So geoengineering. So I don't want to be misunderstood here. I am not an advocate of most kinds of geoengineering, but there are smart ways to do it. And one of them is something that's being worked on up at Cornell by a professor named Johannes Lehmann. And it's basically using, again, a natural method, which is photosynthesis. What photosynthesis, that's what it does. It takes carbon dioxide out of the air and stores it in plants and especially in soil, and out of the atmosphere where it can't be burning things up. And so I think one of the great positive opportunities, and if there are professors or students out there, this is a way you can save the world, literally, is if we can figure out a way to bring that kind of green photosynthesis to scale, to where we really are extracting significant amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we're not going 400, 405, 410, 420, 450 parts per million by the time my daughter's my age, but rather we're going 400, 398, 396, 392, back to the 350 number that Jim Hansen gave to Bill McKibben and that gave the name for 350.org. So that's the next paradigm shift, I would say. And it's precisely because we've waited so long to do this that we're now in a situation, the Arctic is melting faster than ever. There's all the terrible indications. I won't repeat them because they are discouraging. But it's why we can't just focus on emissions. We've got to get down that 400 number. And those of you who are scientists and students of this problem, we really need the best, most creative thinking. Those of you who are engineers and entrepreneurs, we need the best, most creative problem solving on that part of this problem. And I think that, again, it's one of the things that brings a lot of co-benefits I wrote about this in Africa, where it's already happening at a different scale. And when you do that, when you take the carbon out of the air and you turn it into charcoal, and then you bury that charcoal under the soil, not only does it fight climate change, it also increases the fertility of that soil and the water retentiveness of that soil. So in places that are desert, which is where I was writing in the Sahel in Western Africa, where, let's face it, the much more immediate problem is too many children and others falling ill and even dying because of lack of food. You can fight that kind of poverty. You can raise agricultural productivity and reduce global warming all at the same time. So these are the kind of co-benefits that are waiting for us. These are the kinds of victories that can be won and that are being won. And that I hope that after this 4 days here, that we will be even farther along the path here locally towards winning them. So I will stop there, but just with one final plea, which I always make at the end of my talks. I mentioned my daughter and that I'm a father now. And those of you who are interested in this, I and a number of other people, environmentalists who happen to be parents, have started a group called Climate Parents, which is also open to grandparents, because obviously if you're a grandparent, you have been a parent. And our goal is to try and educate and mobilize parents to speak out on climate change. We find it frankly bizarre that parents have been quiet on this issue, given the stakes for what we all hold the most dear in our lives, our kids. It's a cliche that parents say that, before I became a parent, I didn't get it, and now that I'm a parent, you'd have to, I would jump in front of a train to save my daughter. You'd have to kill me before I would let you take my daughter from me. And yet, here's this thing that is threatening to kill our kids, promising to kill our kids, and yet parents have not gotten mobilized on this. So our argument at Climate Parents is essentially that this is now part of your job description as a parent, whether you like it or not. Caring about climate change and getting active about climate change is part of your job description, just like giving your kid proper food and health care and education and clothing and shelter. This is part of your job description. So we invite all of you to check us out. It's climateparents.org. We've been involved in a lot of the Keystone stuff and the March on Washington in February, and when President Obama came to San Francisco 2 weeks ago to try and raise money from the San Francisco rich people, we were there to demand that he talk about climate change and to stand up against Keystone Pipeline and so forth. So those of you who are parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or whatever, please consider joining us, climateparents.org. And I do say that as a parent, I really do just beg you to help me do the best for my daughter. None of us can protect our kids from this alone. I do my best. I have been working at this a long time, but the longer I work on it, the more I realize that one voice alone, one person alone, cannot do it. I cannot save my own kid without you helping to save your kid and my kid and all of our kids. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I warn you that I'm expecting great things from this place. And I look forward to spending the next few days with you. So thank you very much. So the house lights are up. That's good. And I'll just say that I will give, as I did earlier today, I'll give precedence to students if there are any here. But everybody is welcome. Yes, right here on the aisle. Yes.
What would you suggest that we as a nation could do in order to engage the other nations like the bad Chinese to do the right thing?
What could we as a nation do to engage the other nations, including the bad Chinese? you know, the good news is the bad news. We are already engaging them. And unfortunately, we are giving the Chinese every excuse to do not enough. And I say this as someone who went to China in 1996 for the book Earth Odyssey, for Vanity Fair magazine actually sent me there. And I spent 6 weeks in China, and I wrote what I think was the first Western media account of the Chinese environmental crisis. And I said that this was our real China problem, was that they were on this path to basically frying the earth because of using coal, and coal was their way out of absolutely grinding poverty, and that if we were going to change that, that we as the leading polluter, and we are still the leading polluter, the United States, in climate terms, that we had to change our ways here. We had to get serious about it, because until we do, China and its representatives at these climate conferences, its diplomats, can always just say, look, they got rich doing this. They are still in Washington, in the United States. They are still the biggest polluter, and they're not doing anything. And meanwhile, you want us, who still have tens, if not hundreds of millions of people living in real poverty, you want us to stop doing this. And unfortunately, that is the argument that has prevented progress, not just in Copenhagen in 2009, but for years and years on this. And so the main thing that we can do is to recognize we have already engaged on this. We have been sending exactly the wrong message, undercutting the Europeans, by the way, who have wanted to take action on this, and yet, because the big United States wasn't ready to do it, China could safely stand up against. But had the US and the Europeans been serious about emission reductions, I think it would have been very, very difficult for China not to do more. Having said that, let's also emphasize, because China, there is such China bashing in the US political and journalistic conversation. Let's just realize that China is doing a heck of a lot more against climate change than this country is. That is not something you hear, but they are doing far, far more. They're doing plenty bad. They are not, by the way, when your crazy Uncle Fred at Thanksgiving dinner talks about how the Chinese are building a new coal-fired power plant every week, that is no longer true. That was true when I wrote that. I'm the one who wrote that. In 1996, right? So it's very funny when I then encounter these deniers and they start spouting back these things at me. It's like, wait a minute, I'm the reason you know that, you idiot. And that's no longer true. That was true. It's not true now. The Chinese leadership in Beijing is very clear that climate change is a significant, major threat, not just to the country, but to them, to their hold on power, which is by far and away the most important thing to them. They get it, because in particular they are afraid that climate change, and their scientists are telling them this, and I have a whole chapter in Hot about this, that it's going to undercut their ability to feed themselves. And those of you who know anything about modern Chinese history, you know that that is the third rail of Chinese politics, that ever since Mao starved 40 million people in the early 1960s, the single greatest act of mass murder in the 20th century, that the Chinese Communist Party has known that they had better keep people fed, or there will be riots in the streets. And so they get that at the top in Beijing, and they are cutting back on coal. They have shut down a lot of the most polluting cement plants, which are huge carbon emitters, the worst polluting coal-fired power plants. They have done a heck of a lot more on efficiency, and wind we're probably about equal to China. But efficiency, they're ahead. Solar, they're ahead. Solar hot water. Solar hot water is in, everything is so big in China. There's like 100 million homes, 100 million in China that have solar hot water now. That is the new norm. If you're building, apartments in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou or Chongqing or any of those places, that's what they have now. So there's a lot that's going on there. So don't buy this notion that the Chinese are this terrible, evil bogeyman. Believe me, there's a lot of reasons to criticize China, including on climate. But the United States is the last who should be doing that. So what do we need to do? We need to begin electing and holding again our elected officials to standard on this and say, look, we have got to show greater leadership. We now have a Secretary of State, John Kerry, who to date has been a very outspoken and committed advocate on climate action. He was in the Senate, and he's now in a position where he could make a real difference on this stuff. He, in particular, will have the Keystone Pipeline decision is going to go across his desk. And what he's going to say, it's hard to know, although believe me, I spent 10 years as a reporter in Washington at the start of my career. It's very hard for me to imagine that the president gave him that job as Secretary of State without talking about Keystone. So presumably, they have come to an understanding about that. They haven't shared with the rest of us yet, and the understanding could be, well, let's look at the science, and I'm not saying that a deal has been cut or that they've decided what they're going to do, but you can be sure they talked about it, because activists made that an issue. That Keystone would have gone through long ago if Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen and the indigenous peoples in Canada and a lot of activists in Nebraska and all across this country had not made it an issue. So now it's an issue that the president has to face and that Secretary Kerry has to face. And those of you who haven't heard yet, they're now, probably some of you have gotten these emails because I certainly get them as a reporter from all the environmental groups are now trying to round up people to send in petitions to the Secretary of State to be against Keystone, to call on him to oppose the Keystone pipeline. So that's another way for people to get involved. Now, there was a question here in the middle. Yes. And then I'll move over this direction. Yes, in the second row. Yeah.
I was interested to hear you talk about citizen action, as you said, passing under the radar of the national media. I tend to think of it as being deliberately ignored by the national media. Do you really think we pass under the radar?
I think that both happen, but never underestimate the navel gazing of the Washington and the New York press corps. They really care much more about what people, as they say, in this town are talking about in their Twitter feeds and their Georgetown dinner parties and all of that. They don't really care very much about what's happening out in the rest of the country. So then on top of that sort of regional bias, of course, you're putting your finger on another fact, which is that the mainstream media rarely covers activism or movements until they get to a point where they can't be ignored. And I will here put in a little plug for The Nation magazine, where I've been the environment correspondent for quite a while. That's one of the reasons to read The Nation, is that we cover these movements. Now, we don't cover them as cheerleaders. We're not activists. A journalist's role is a different role than activism. And one of the things that we do as journalists is, just as with public officials, our job is to kind of hold up a mirror to the activists and to the movements too, and show what's going well and what's not going well. But the main point is that we cover those movements. We think that they are newsworthy. And it is very true that the mainstream media does not share that. And it's not just on the environment. I mean, I don't think there's any major paper left in the United States that has a labor correspondent. There used to be, all of them used to have a labor correspondent. There are exceptions. You know, the New York Times, for example, and others, and television was very important in the early days of the civil rights movement. And of course, during the 60s, with a lot of this was before my time, but you can read the books, the anti-war movement got the attention of the media eventually. And they will eventually pay attention if you knock off enough politicians, you know. And that's why, but you really do have to do that. And of course, I knock off figuratively. But it is very hard to get Washington and New York newsrooms to pay attention to what's going on around the country. It's almost as hard as it is to get them to pay attention to what's going on outside the country, which is another scandal. Yeah, here are the gentlemen on the aisle there.
I wonder if you see any risk in the sense that in having successes with managing the unavoidable somehow gives justification to people who were, had been deniers for a long time, the Senator Inhofes of the world, gives them justification to then say, see, we can manage it, even if it's true what you're saying, which I don't believe for a minute, we can manage it, we're a plucky bunch, and we're resourceful, and we can do it, we've done it before, and we can do it again.
Yeah, I write about that in the book because the history of the climate debate, that was very much the argument that was being made 10 years ago in Europe. And by the way, the climate conversation in Europe is about 10 years ahead of this country. And so that was exactly the argument that was made against many of the best scientists and activists who began to say in the 2001, 2002 era that, hey, we've got to start talking about adaptation. So for example, John Hans-Joachim Schellenberger, who's the head of the, who was at that time the chief science advisor to the German government, he has a quote in the book that says, I was called a traitor. I was called a traitor by activists on the very grounds that you're raising, that, hey, if we start talking about adaptation, it gives the bad guys an out to say we don't have to do anything on mitigation. The irony of that was that the very people who were talking about this adaptation were the leaders who had been calling for years action on mitigation, including, by the way, the Red Cross. They've played a great, very positive role internationally on this. And they were one of the first who said, we've got to start talking about adaptation on human solidarity grounds, because of course it is the poor who get first and who get hit first and worst on this stuff. So the Red Cross was saying, from a humanitarian point of view, we have got to be talking about adaptation. But they were attacked, they were criticized wrongly, I think. And I think history has shown that that was a very small-minded point of view. Understandable, because again, the Bush-Cheney administration, that was exactly what they said. When I interviewed them for that Vanity Fair story that led to me writing Hot, that was exactly what President Bush's science advisor said, essentially, is that we're going to solve this problem in the long term and we'll adapt in the short term. So I'm not denying that that was out there, and I've even had very high-level environmentalists off the record say, no, we can't talk about adaptation for the very reason you say. But I think, frankly, that the climate problem has transcended that now. It's surpassed that. We don't have, now I would say that would be not just wrong, but morally bankrupt to say that we cannot deal with adaptation. That's why the mantra is avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. And I would now begin to add a third, and extract the carbon. So let's stop there, and then we'll shift to part two. Okay.
And now for this part two, we've got some valuable respondents to join us up here. Professor Dr. Shorna Allred from the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University, who will also be in the opening plenary on Saturday morning. And with us for tonight is Mark Watson from the New York Energy Research and Development Authority. And he's been very involved with the state's major push on understanding exactly what the impacts are and how they will affect us. So if Mark and Shorna can come up and join us and Barbara, Mark is going to interview us.
Okay, so I now get to turn from being an author back into being a journalist and grill you guys for the benefit of the crowd here. So as I take it, the idea here of this session is really to talk at a quite a local, regional level about what's happening and what can be done, and how people can plug into this, right? So I think it might be good, Mark, if we just begin by talking about that massive volume that you put in my hand as we sat down here tonight. I think a lot of people don't realize just how much work has been done in certain places, including in New York State. And you told a wonderful story as you walked in tonight about a wonderful story about a sad event. That after Hurricane Sandy occurred, you will all remember that Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bloomberg and others were saying, well, we've got to figure out how to keep this from happening again. And to do that, obviously, we need a good scientific basis of what's happening. What are we looking at? What is coming at us from climate change? And you guys had the opportunity to answer that question. So tell us what you said when the governor was asking for that.
Well, we actually had a case
and
study.
Who you are. So you should say who
so
you are.
I manage the environmental research programs at NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And many people know NYSERDA as the organization that provides incentives for energy efficiency projects, and we run the renewable portfolio standard in New York State to help support renewable energy like wind and kinetic hydro and solar. And we are also involved with state energy planning in the state. But in our R&D section, my section is really focusing on environmental research that is looking at the impacts of energy production and use. So we look at things like acid rain and mercury, things typically associated with coal burning, and particulate matter, ozone, also alternative energy, looking at the impacts of things like wind turbines and biofuels. Because no matter what energy source you're going to pick, there's going to be some sort of environmental impact. But back around, I guess it was around 2006, we had an opportunity to revise our research plan because the majority of our funds come from the system benefit charge. That's a little fee that you pay on your electric bill every month. Most of that goes to those energy efficiency programs, but a little bit of that goes to my research programs. And at that time, as we were revising our plan, we didn't have any climate change research program. So I snuck it in there. I made the mistake of calling it global warming, and when it was reviewed by the Public Service Commission, who, by the way, now is very much on board, but back then, the response in the side column, it was before they were tracking changes, said no. And then there was another little thing written down at the bottom that said, why should New York deal with the global problem? So I took it out. And then I immediately put it back in, and I changed it to climate change. And my rationale when I was asked about it was, look, when we had our acid deposition reduction program in New York State, that was really spearheaded by our State Department of Environmental Conservation, we knew that we weren't going to solve the acid rain problem just by controlling sulfur and nitrogen emissions in New York State. But we knew that we had to lead by example. So we needed to lead by example with climate change as well. So it was approved, and the first thing that we did right out at the gate was to start two big projects. One really to help develop greenhouse gas reduction cost curves to say, what are the biggest bang for the buck items that we could do in New York State to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And then I said, and we need to do adaptation. And I like the question over here because there was a big gasp. And they said, but isn't that giving up? And I said, no, because like you said, Mark, this is going to be around for a while, and we're going to keep warming. And we need to figure out what we can do to better prepare ourselves. So we put out a solicitation to pick a team of scientists to say, what is the science on climate change in New York State? What does it mean for New York State? How are we vulnerable across many different sectors, from our ecosystems and public health to transportation and energy systems and agriculture, right across the board? And what can we do to start preparing for it? So we had a team of scientists from 3 different universities to help us do that. It was Columbia, it was Hunter College as part of CUNY, the City University of New York, and Cornell. with Art De Gaetano as being the lead here, but my friend David Wolf over here, who was a lead on much of what went into our report. So we did produce this report, which was a big undertaking. We finished it at the end of 2011. The long name is Responding to Climate Change in New York State, an Integrated Assessment for Effective Climate Change Adaptation. We call it ClimeAid for short. It's a lot easier. So this project looked at 16 regional and global climate models. It divided up the state into different regions. It says, what are we expecting in each of those regions as far as temperature goes, on precipitation, on drought, on storms, and how is it going to affect different sectors? We have a case study in there for each sector. We have an economic assessment in each sector. So we published this. It's available on our website by chapter, in case you don't want to read it cover to cover. It's over 600 pages. If you just go to nyserda.ny.gov/ClimeAid, you'll get right to the page. If you don't want it for bedtime reading, there's a much shorter synthesis that's available on there too. I'll leave these with you.
Thank you
for your
very
life.
much, Mark. Thank you.
Less to carry
Just
back.
wondering what I was going to read tonight.
So that's where we got right out of the gate. And I really liked it, Mark, when you said you need to believe the science. I think we're in a position at NYSERDA to help provide science that you can believe in. So this was our initial undertaking. We've started about 10 other projects on the adaptation side since then that are looking deeper into things like coastal erosion and a Cornell project looking at better predicting extreme rain events. I'm happy to announce just recently approved was a project where we have funding for a New York State Climate Science Clearinghouse. And this is going to be led by a team from NESCOM, which is the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, and NOAA, and the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and, you guessed it, Cornell. And it will actually be housed at Cornell. And what this is going to do is pull together all the data that is related to climate change from many state sources, regional sources, and put it all in one place and try to make it much more easily accessible. It'll be GIS-based. It's going to be really slick. Because of that, it's going to be about 2 years before it probably hits the streets. But we're really excited about getting that up and running. So we do have science that you can believe in.
And yeah, I love the story. You got to do something that so many government bureaucrats dream of, which is when the governor says, what do we got on this? You can say, here you go, Gov. We had this for you in 2011, and it really is right there.
And after Hurricane Sandy, there is I could call it a renewed interest, I guess, in climate change. We do have a number of commissions that are looking specifically at climate change. This report was really instrumental in providing input to those commissions that are looking at that right now. So when those commissions were formed, we were very busy doing a lot of slicing and dicing and passing information out that we'd already put together.
Let me ask one follow-up question and then turn to you, Shorna. One of the things that is happening now in California is that, and I wonder if you're doing it here, is that, again, they've got similar documents. And now the governor's office is beginning to go out and have workshops with local county and town officials all throughout the state to try and help them talk through how to access this enormous, because we do have a lot of data about it now,
right.
How to access it, and not just how to access the data, but how do you make it real in your township, in your county? How do you access the kinds of potential federal funds that could come? How do you get tied into the other localities, not just in California, but around the country who might face similar problems? Are you guys doing anything like that here in New York?
We are. We've started, we were doing a few things. So we've held a few webinars just sort of as a follow-up to the ClimeAid report to get just an overview of the science out there. We did a case study on Irene and Lee as a webinar, and then we're looking to schedule one in a couple months that will really summarize what some of the local communities are doing, sort of as case studies. But there are a couple other things that that communities can do through some other programs run out of different shops at NYSERDA. One is the Climate Smart Communities program, where we have funding and assistance to help towns and municipalities determine their carbon footprint, look at ways to help lower their carbon emissions. Actually, there is an adaptation component in there too, if desired. So that's one area, but then there's the new program, which is
Sorry,
called...
but do you guys reach out affirmatively to them, or do they have to come to you to get
We
that?
have contractors that are pushing this out on our behalf. And then there are, which are in each of the regions in the state. And there's a new program called the Cleaner Greener program, which will have, it already gave $1 million each to the 10 regions in the state for developing sustainability plans. And now in June, we're going to be putting out, well, ultimately it'll be $90 to $100 million to help implementing those plans. So I think in June, I think $30 million is going to be made available in 3 areas. One, to help...
This is state money?
This is Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative money.
Oh, okay.
It's funding this. So there will be money to help streamline PV and electric vehicle zoning. So you can help get it through the approval process quicker. There will be some, that'll probably be about $1 million at $25,000 a pop to do that. There's going to be, I think, $5 million set aside with up to $400,000 per area or municipality to help with some of their comprehensive plans to look at it from a greenhouse gas reduction perspective and adaptation potentially as well. And then the majority of the money will go towards capital projects that will be evaluated on their potential to be consistent with the regional plans that reduce greenhouse gases, have resiliency, another word for adaptation, built into them, and also some other evaluation factors that are related to economic development.
That sounds terrific. I'm really glad to hear that that's happening. And again, it's something that you're not going to see a lot of press coverage of because it's seen as too dry or technical, but this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of a place taking this seriously. So Shorna, I want to turn to you now because you have studied a lot of places that are trying to take climate change seriously, and in particular looking at adaptation. And I wonder if you could just tell us how much of your studies have been devoted here to New York State, and where do you see, you said something interesting when we were talking before about how there seems to be some correlation that it's the urban localities that are somewhat more likely to take action than the rural localities. And I wonder if you can just share with us along those same lines what are the keys to success that incline a given locality to try to do this and then actually carry it out as opposed to maybe falter along the way. So.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that, and I really appreciated your comments about the importance of locality because and the local level and the power in local action, because that's really borne out in the research that we've done here in New York State with regard to local governments, towns and cities, and what they're doing to mitigate or adapt to climate change.
When you say we, this is my mistake as the moderator. I should have said who we is. Why don't you tell everybody who we is?
My name is Shorna Allred, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources, and I work in the Human Dimensions Research Unit. And so we do work specifically looking at and examining the relationship between people and the environment, and the work that myself and my colleagues in both cooperative extension and in research have worked on this issue.
And how long have you guys been looking at this in New York State?
So I have been here since 2007. So my research program really started at around that time, looking at these particular issues here in New York State. And I was immediately drawn to the Hudson Valley when I was examining places in New York to really look at decision making around key environmental issues. And the Hudson Valley has been called the Saudi Arabia of water. They are rich in, as Saudi Arabia is with oil, the Hudson Valley is rich in water resources to such a great extent. And so a lot of my work is focused in that particular area, because it is an area that is very prone and vulnerable to flooding associated with extreme weather events that is most likely to be our future under climate change.
And you've looked at environmental factors in general, but it sounds like you're maybe focusing more and more on climate as time goes on, or?
Yes, and I really wanted to examine how local governments are addressing and really experiencing climate change, looking at their attitudes towards climate science, how it's impacting them personally, and then also from a policy or decision-making perspective, how they are making decisions at the local level about all of the sectors that Mark described, transportation and housing and zoning and all of these decisions that are made at the local level. I wanted to find out to what extent those are informed by climate science and climate change. And our research showed that that flooding and extreme weather events is really causing municipalities that's one of the ways that we're seeing some of the action happening at the local level, is especially related to adaptation. That adaptation was really significantly influenced by the extent to which that municipality had experienced an extreme weather event in terms of flooding in the past, associated with the hurricanes and tropical storms, but also just high rainfall events as well.
Can you name one or two municipalities that illustrate that in a useful way?
Sure. I mean, I think one that rises to the top is Kingston, New York, in Ulster County, and they've really engaged in a participatory planning process to examine their vulnerabilities and really bringing the community together, all the different sectors, private and public sector, to really utilize the science, to utilize scientific models of various scenarios that could impact the waterfront communities, the Strand, where all of the restaurants are located, and one of the state's only maritime museums. So there's a lot of culture and history, business, and of course, people living in these areas. And so it's interesting to see how they're really, I think, on the forefront of doing this kind of participatory planning that incorporates climate science and climate models, and really asking that climate question: how will these resources be impacted, and then what are we going to do about it? Are we going to fortify and build more infrastructure? Are we going to adapt, get people, businesses, et cetera, out of the floodplain? Or are we going to adapt, meaning structures that can withstand flooding? Or are we going to retreat and get out of the floodplain? So it's a hard question. They're in the planning process right now, but I think the approach that they've taken is one that could potentially be a model for other communities in terms of how they're addressing this.
Tell us a little more about that, because I think for this group here, and I'm going to switch to you, Gay, after this, because it's a good segue. It's fascinating to hear you say that they've got a real participatory model. That is rare in American politics, and it made me think again to the Dutch example, where at the Dutch example, it really is participatory. It's right there at the local level. How, in, say, Kingston, do you reach out to not just the usual suspects, the usual civic leaders? How do you get those families who maybe aren't so involved in this, and maybe they're economically disadvantaged, which are oftentimes the ones who are going to be hit the hardest? Have they actually been able to engage those people, and if so, how? And then secondly, beyond that, what's the secret for how they've been able to pull this together? And is it is there some secret sauce that other communities can emulate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's all about relationships. So this idea of what we call in political science advocacy coalitions, these coalitions of organizations and people that come together around a common issue that under other circumstances wouldn't be as likely to collaborate. And flooding is very, very personal. It's something that impacts people at a very personal level, their homes, their property. And so that, as unfortunate as these events have been, I also think that it makes people much more willing to come to the table and have that conversation, that difficult conversation about will this happen again? Absolutely, it will happen again. That's certain in this particular part of New York State, and so and so I think that has facilitated some of the dialogue is having that personal experience. It's not just about the statistics or the models. That's actually some of the interesting psychological research that's come out. Some of the research that's been done at Columbia University on climate change communication is that really just focusing on the models and the statistics, that it really doesn't resonate many times. It'll resonate with some people that are sort of rational cognitive thinkers, but some of us rely on emotion as well, and so we have to think about both of those pathways by which we make decisions. We make them sometimes rationally, sometimes with emotion, or sometimes some combination of those. And so a lot of times the climate communication is either overly emotional and very, very negative in terms of the forecasting, which actually has a boomerang effect of making people emotionally numb in a sense. What can they do, or just taking one small step and then giving up. And so I think that having that personal experience really does bring people to that next level of then connecting some of the science and the climate models with, okay, I do need to make a commitment to helping my community address this, because it's something that's not only affecting me, but also my community. And
when they have these discussions, I mean, in quite concrete terms, how do they gather in a place like this? Do they sit at a school classroom? Is it groups of 10? Is it groups of 200 or what?
I mean, interestingly, a lot of the meetings for the task force, the flooding task force, are held at the Steelhouse restaurant, which is right on the waterfront, and is a building that can withstand flooding in terms of the structure. And so I think it provides a kind of interesting backdrop for these discussions that the various sectors are having. But they're held at a place that's meaningful in the community.
And how many people are in the room?
I'm trying to think. I actually don't know off the top of my head how many people show up at each meeting. I think it's around 30 or so.
I mean,
Mark, do you know?
Well, I just know that area is really blessed with a lot of non-government organizations and environmental groups like Clearwater and Hudson River Keeper and Scenic Hudson and Citizens Campaign for the Environment. And they do such a great job in really reaching out at the local level and one-on-one and helping to take a lot of the science and distilling it down in how it impacts the people that are really interested in their own groups.
Right.
So this is more of that social capital, more of that social infrastructure.
The non-governmental organizations, and our research has really shown this, is that for adaptation, leadership is key. For mitigation, top-down can work, and we've seen that communities are, those that are taking mitigation action are doing so because it's more of a top-down mandate versus a grassroots. But with regard to the adaptation planning, we found that really having a key leadership and having those partnerships, that those were the two of the factors that were most significant in the model of predicting whether a municipality was taking adaptation actions or not. It was really about partnerships and leadership. And as Mark mentioned, the quantity and quality of the NGOs in that community, I think, really do play a role, because they can help provide that glue between, between the organizations, but then they're also very adept at helping to distill this scientific information in ways that make the information accessible. They're visual models that they're using, and so people can see what it might look like under various
There's a lot of
high
people are
water
visual
scenarios.
learners. Some people are visual learners, some people learn with their heart, some people learn with their head.
And I remember watching a webinar a couple of months ago, and they've been using something called the COAST model that gives you this sort of 3D visual image of your Kingston waterfront and where things like the water treatment plant are, and the public infrastructure and the police station, all these things, and then what would it cost if a flood of a certain level happened, and you get these tall bars of how much it's going to cost us as taxpayers. So like Ron Sims, being able to educate the people, that's been very effective. And
There will be soon 2 new visualization tools for looking at flooding from the Troy Dam in Hudson all the way down to New York City. We wanted to fund a project that would do that and use the state-of-the-art models. And we ended up picking 2 because they were both really good, so we'll see how they do against each other.
Yeah, I think that helps people grasp, what they need to do at the local level in terms of their tax base and how to spend the money, and then make those difficult decisions about, well, do we fortify the water treatment plant, or do we move the water treatment plant or the sewage treatment plant, get it out of here?
They're really difficult decisions, and the study that we did that was statewide, one of the major barriers that local governments said they were facing in taking action was not having these models that they really could utilize at the local level, models that are being used like Kingston. And so what I'm hoping to do as part of my research program is to highlight what these municipalities are doing through case studies, so that other municipalities can learn about these tools and how they could use them, or in some cases they may need to be developed for their municipality.
Barbara, I want to ask you, because
I was hoping you'd go to Gay.
well, I did, and Gay spoke.
As you know, there's really not much going on in the legislature.
She will,
Okay.
she will speak again. But I know also that you've been involved in the fracking issue here
quite
in
a
New
bit.
York, which is, probably, certainly to an outside reporter, looks like it is the hot button issue on this front right now.
I would agree.
And rather than get into a long sort of recitation about fracking and whether it's good or bad, I want to ask you a little bit different question, because I have a feeling that most of the people here in the room tonight probably are opposed to fracking and maybe even active in that. But getting back to this idea of the avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable, have you seen in the fight around fracking here a way to, obviously you're trying to avoid the unmanageable side of it, but are you also able to be tying into that the work that you're doing on avoiding the unmanageable, resiliency and managing on the unavoidable part of it? If you follow my question, in terms of fighting fracking, fighting fracking is part of the first part of you're avoiding the unmanageable.
Right.
But what all of the scientists say is that we have to do both at once.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, have you seen any of that kind of work going on as the arguments are put forward about fracking, and whether it be in the legislature or out here in the populace? Are you able to build on the anti-fracking work to also bring people along on the adaptation and resiliency?
Yeah, I think there's a shift going on. I think after 2 or 3 years, and so many people had worked so hard on the fracking issue, I think there was people wanted to continue that work and stop fracking in New York State, but also people were saying, okay, what else do we need to be doing? And we were getting the question thrown at us sometimes, well, you use energy, right? What's your answer? Where is the energy going to come from? And as you say, someone said the environmentalists have to have an answer and have to talk about that. So I think that it led more and more people into very concrete, saying we need to deal with the other issues. We need to talk about where our energy is going to come from, talk about renewable energies, and start pushing that agenda. And at the same time, start dealing more with the effects of climate change. But, because, again, the legislature doesn't move very quickly, the state government doesn't move very quickly on these things. It took us, we just did an Article 10 citing bill 2 years ago, Mark, 3 years ago, and it took 10 years to get, something done that really needed to be done. It is going to improve the situation on wind and solar in significant ways, but it took a very long time. And now we're sort of struggling about can we do more? There are one House bills and one two-House bill that are going to sit there and probably not do very much for a while without a lot of public pressure. So clearly Hurricane Sandy has more people talking about adaptation. I was part of a hearing in New York City, the Assembly Committee on Environmental Conservation, of which I'm a member, held 2 public hearings in the aftermath of Sandy, one in New York and one out on Long Island. And 31 witnesses came forward to talk, and a lot of that discussion, of course, was about adaptation. What are we going to do? So that storm has really...
That's not changing the dynamics in Albany? Because
well,
again,
it's
from
hard,
the outside, you see the governor who had not spoken on this issue in the past.
Right.
The governor changed his tune, his State of the State address.
Yeah.
We're talking about $1 billion solar bank.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't say that's nothing.
There is one interesting thing that's popped up recently in the last few weeks. A 2-House bill. It's very hard to get good environmental bills that start out from both houses. Usually the Assembly passes a bill 4 or 5 times before we get the Senate to take it up. That's usually been the case. But we do have a 2-House bill on Engelbright, Maziarz in the Senate, and Steve Engelbright in the Assembly, which is essentially a budget bill, which means it's not going to happen until at the earliest next year's budget. But it would put in place funding for 10 years for the governor's New York Sun program, which is a solar initiative to do more on solar. And so that's kind of interesting that something concrete, we've got a concrete, some thinking of planning and funding for solar over a 10-year, with a commitment for 10 years. And of course, that's about giving business the assurance that the funding is going to be there for 10 years and allow. So we'll see where that discussion goes. That is, I think, a slight shift right now. We had not been able to get a solar bill going.
And do you think that the governor's apparent shift in at least his rhetoric in the climate problem, is that a lasting shift?
I don't, the governor doesn't call me and talk to me very often. So I don't really know what he's thinking.
Come on,
it was very significant. Obviously, he when he came to Binghamton, I was with him one day when he came out, and I think it was about a few weeks after the storm. And, it was clearly still very much weighing on him, taking up most of his time, and I, gave him my sympathies and thanked him for starting to talk about climate change. And, it was clearly, something he was ready to do. So I think he's got to deal with the reality of it. I think that the state needs to respond. The state's being greatly affected. And I'll be surprised if he doesn't keep pushing on that.
Yeah, because he's clearly shifted on this after Sandy. Yeah. So the forces in the state that have been against that in the past, how have they reacted to the governor's apparent new position on this? Has there been pushback, or are they kind of biding their time and hoping it's going to blow over, or what?
Well, I was reading the memos of opposition to one of the good a bill that we put forward in the Assembly. The chair of our ENCON committee, Bob Sweeney, has a bill to enact. 7 other states have enacted a climate action plan, have it in statute. And we have sort of a draft plan that hasn't been finalized, if I'm correct about that, Mark. Maybe you're more familiar.
That's close.
But the bill would actually put it in statute and enact it and tell DEC what they have to do, and that will cap emissions across the state and do what most other states have done, say, go back to 1990 levels and then start reducing by 80% at 2050, what probably 7 other states have done and put in law. where was I going with that
And you're,
comment?
as an example of whether the forces of
Right.
evil, I mean the forces against
Yeah,
us
so
are
I
trying-
was reading the memos on that bill, the
Yeah.
memos of opposition, and you know, it's kind of the usual cast on both sides. The environmentalists saying this is great, we need to do it, it's overdue, and the more conservative forces in the state, the Business Council, the Petroleum Institute, the Farm Bureau in this case, saying no, this is bad for farmers. You know, farmers are already doing enough on climate change, and this will make them uncompetitive. So it's the usual sort of uncompetitive. You can't do this state by state. We need a global. You know, the conservatives saying we need a global plan here.
Right.
At the same time,
Same
of course,
thing
that
that
the
you saw.
conservatives
Why are we
on
trying
the
to
national
solve
level
a
fight a
national
global
problem?
plan. So you know, we're always caught between that. You know,
And
those
you know,
arguments.
similar to that is, I mean, the 9 states that are participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that plan goes through the end of 2014 or 15. But discussions are starting already on what do we do next. And within New York State, the discussions are really focusing on, you know, tightening the cap, and how far should it be tightened, and what are we going to do with proceeds. And so the input that we get, I mean, there'll be public hearings on these, and the input that we can get can be really instrumental in pushing us in the direction that many of us want to go. I mean, we're at NYSERDA, you know, we're not a regulatory agency. We try to get the information out there so people can respond to it, and we're hoping that happens.
So that's another opportunity then for people in this room to insert yourselves into this process. There is a process that is happening, and the information is out there, but it's not going to go forward if you don't push it. And so in that regard, Gay, I wanted to follow up what I had planned to do before. As you were listening to what Shorna was saying about the Kingston and some of the other localities that are doing this really interesting stuff about participatory planning and all. I mean, you're somebody who has been working here at the local level on these issues for a long time. How does that correspond to your experience here, both the positive lessons and the negative lessons, the things that you would see as successes and the things that you might want to redo? How do you look at that now that you've kind of been fighting here on the trench level for such a long time?
Well, since it's getting late, I'll answer fairly briefly, partly because if you all come on Saturday to our conference, you're going to hear directly from the people being involved in many of these initiatives. We have a whole session called Engaging on Energy in the Community track, where you're going to hear from the grassroots groups, including Sustainable Tompkins. Mary Beth will rep us, of what we've been doing to help people make the shift off of fossil carbon and invest in renewables. So there's a strong grassroots movement going on and has been for a while, and interestingly now aided and abetted by all the anti-fracking groups who are also, you know, recognizing that they have to walk their talk if they're going to say we don't want to supply natural gas out of New York, then that means we have to reduce demand for natural gas in New York. So how do we work together to do that? That'll be one of the stories. And then other efforts that are going on are at the local government level. Isn't that Ed Marks up there? His team wrote the first Cleaner, Greener plan for New York State. And it was years back when I worked part-time for Energy Smart Communities that I approached the county about adopting you know, some policies and procedures for becoming more sustainable, and which also, meanwhile, the city of Ithaca was on that track as well. And both the county and the city had set those commitments of 80% reductions by 2050. So, and now some of the towns are doing that. So it really is fun to live in Tompkins County. I've been here 33 years, and watching the shift over the last 10 years of how this is showing up in our comprehensive plans at the county level, the first energy element in the county plan for exactly, well, how are we going to do this, was passed by Tompkins County's legislature as an example for others. So if you come on Saturday, you're going to be able to plug into a lot of the sessions that are going to tell some of these stories and give examples, not only from Tompkins County, but from other counties as well. I would say that though we are still very much challenged by the need to engage our fellow citizens and to have the social courage to do so. And that's one of the reasons we're offering this conference, is to help you learn more about it and to become more confident and strong in how you talk to your doubting Thomas coworker or your brother-in-law that rolls his eyes at you when you bring these topics up. So another important piece that you sort of alluded to earlier, you did, Shorna, the emotional and psychological aspects and the moral aspects of this issue that we're facing. That's why one of our sessions is called Climate Justice, Climate Grief. And we have a panel of a reverend, a chair of a philosophy department, and a spiritual counselor who are going to explore the connections between this great injustice and the grief that we feel. Because this is a very important thing for us to talk about openly and not ignore as a fundamental thing that's affecting our beings. And I think will make us more powerful in our conversations with others if we can find the words to talk about this with each other. So I would recommend that you all come on Saturday
Yeah, I
and
think
join
it's
us.
important too to say that with all of these panels, there's going to be a lot of discussion after every panelist, all the panelists finish. They won't take up that much time. There's going to be a lot of give and take with the audience. We want a real discussion here.
And at the closing plenary, lots of feedback, time for feedback. Mark will be sharing his observations of us for the 4 days he's been with us, and a chance for all of us to start identifying also what are our next steps together. You don't want to just go home from the conference. You want to be figuring out what's our plan here. There's a lot of stuff going on, but how much more connected can we be in that plan, and can we figure out how to get many more people in the conversation with us?
Amen. Now, are we taking questions now, or are we?
I think we can go out in the, we're selling books, and Mark can autograph.
Are there any burning questions? Do I see a hand up there?
And
I
I'll
thought I
also
saw a
say,
hand.
if you're tired now, you're too tired to do the books now, that's fine. I'll be around the rest of the weekend.
Yeah.
But somebody up there is burning, obviously,
got a
to
burning
ask a
question
question.
up here.
So, shout it out.
Is that Martha?
I just have to say thank you very much. I agree about the fight about coal, but I'm afraid that it's been replaced by gas. It's not conventional gas, it's unconventional gas. That means fracking. And I think if we ignore methane, carbon dioxide is not the only global warming gas. We have to pay attention to methane at a federal level. The law miscounts it. It counts it at a 100-year time frame. And we don't have 100 years. At the 20-year time frame, methane is 105 times more damaging than carbon dioxide in terms of the planet gases. We cannot, I think the idea that coal is the worst on global warming, I do not think that's correct. I think the science has been broken, the path has been laid here at Cornell, and field research is showing that their estimates, Howard and Grafia, their estimates were conservative. The methane, the fugitive releases of methane related to upstream and downstream with natural gas are making us go in the wrong direction. So I beg you, please to look at that research. We are not saving ourselves by transforming coal into gas plants.
Yeah, I hope nobody thought I was saying that.
Say, isn't it great that we've shut down all these gas plants? Take a look.
Coal plants.
We shut down all these coal plants or prevented their construction. Please take a look. The industry has only been too happy to say, okay, fine, we have gas. And it's cheap right now until they figure out how to export it. And then it'll be at $15 instead of $3.50.
Yes, it probably
So
will.
I beg you to look at that.
I have looked at that. I certainly have looked at that. I think that we might be talking past each other a little bit, and I won't get into the details of it, but it is certainly true that the fugitive emissions on methane are very problematic, and I am not here to defend natural gas, but I would say that historically, that coal has very definitely been by far the greatest climate destroyer. and that it really turns on what you said, that fracking is a new way of producing natural gas. It's relatively new. And those fugitive emissions that are coming from fracking, that does change the equation going forward from here. But from here into the past, coal has been a much bigger part of the problem. Going forward, which is where a lot of the argument has been, from even some well-intentioned environmentalists who have been saying for a long time that, and going back to the great Barry Commoner saying this in the 70s and 80s, that natural gas could be the bridging fuel to a green future. And unfortunately, the Sierra Club, whose former executive director, Carl Pope, while they were doing this anti-coal work, Carl Pope was secretly, this was not a decision, in fact, I reported on this in that Mother Jones story, this was not a decision that even the board of directors of the Sierra Club was aware of, that they were taking that money from Chesapeake, the natural gas company. That was quite a quiet operation. But they did that, I think, at the time that the research that Cornell and other places have been doing on natural gas had not come out yet. And so there was that belief that still natural gas could be that bridging fuel. I think that the new research has, especially the latest papers, have made it harder and harder to make that argument going forward. But that's because it is fracking and it's a different kind of natural gas production. But I think it's clearly that you guys are on the cutting edge of that's the big fight now in the United States, is around fracking. I was just up in the Bakken oil reserves up in North Dakota doing a story. And we're now, this is a big story I'm going to be doing for the nation coming up, is on fracking in California. They're now trying to frack California. And astonishingly, Governor Jerry Brown, who is the reason, going back to the first time he was governor in the 1970s, he's the reason why California has done so much in the past on climate. Governor Brown has not come out strongly against fracking to date. And it's quite interesting. People are wondering, some cynical people are saying, well, somebody got to Brown, he's not being the usual green Jerry Brown. Other people are saying he's doing a little bit of a rope-a-dope kind of thing with not showing his cards too quickly and get the guys, the fracking forces, to overplay their hands. So that's a fight I would say that you all should watch because, again, California has traditionally been the environmental trendsetter in this country. And certainly I will be trying to be talking there about what you all are doing here, because clearly New York is certainly one of the cutting edge places in the fracking fight. And you've taught us all a lot that the rest of the country can use as well. So maybe we call it a night at that point?
Yes, I think
Yeah?
so. And
So
thank you
all.
again, all of you. Thank you, Mark, Shorna, and Mark Watson.